Today we're going to look at the M18 retro game handheld. Visually a competitor to the RG405V, but looks can be deceiving. Previously we looked at the M17, a Retroid Pocket 3 inspired handheld that was one of these nice cheap options you can find on AliExpress that performed better than I thought it would, despite not having a great screen and a cheapy plasticky feel. The M18 is now the latest release from the same company, but this time instead of being inspired by the Retroid Pocket 3, this seems to be inspired by the RG405V. Now the RG405V was a fantastic console from Anbernic, not just because of the power but because of the form factor as well. It was a really impressive vertical handheld of the likes we'd not seen before. And the M18 takes a lot of design choices from that and does it well, with a very similar size and chunkiness, as well as those awesome grips on the back that make holding the device feel really ergonomic and really comfortable, as well as providing a much more engrossing gaming experience than we're used to on vertical handhelds. However, as with the M17, the M18 doesn't use the best plastics available. You can instantly feel that it is a cheaper quality of plastic to the 405V. However, it doesn't mean that it feels bad, and it's definitely an improvement on the plastics that we did feel in the M17. Overall initial impressions are that the M18 feels really good and does a great job of emulating the visual aspects and the ergonomics of the 405V, including the great placement of the shoulder buttons, which give a curved effect, which means that your fingers fit perfectly when needing to use them. However, beyond very initial impressions, you can start to see some of the differences that the M18 has gone for over the 405V, some design choices that I actually quite like. To start with, the analog buttons are staggered, meaning that the left analog stick is above the D-pad. And for the types of games that devices like this, or we come to expect devices like this to be able to play, I think this is a great choice. The 405V was a great console, very ergonomic, but when you were using the analog sticks, it did feel like your fingers were poked down a little bit. Having the analog stick above the D-pad means it's much more comfortable to use on the M18, and this I would say is an improvement over the 405V. Following on with button placements, and another very obvious change is the position of the start and select buttons. I don't think I've ever seen start and select buttons angled like this before, but you know what? It works really well. It looks intriguing and gives a very unique look to the console, but it's also very ergonomic in their placement, and I found it very comfortable to try and use the start and select buttons whenever you've needed to. Finally, and probably most noticeably though, is the screen. The screen is very different from the 405V. The 405V had a 4-inch 16:9 aspect ratio screen, whereas the M18 clearly goes for the widescreen choice. And although using that type of screen gives a lot more real estate to the controls, it does look a little bit squeezed and cramped on a device this big. Now the screen itself is very unique and actually looks great. It's a massive improvement over what we saw on the M17. It's got a better resolution and doesn't have any of that dulling plastic over the front of it that just kills the view. I think they've done a great job improving the screen on the M18. But the fact of the matter remains that a screen like this is only really purposeful for a select few types of consoles. Most systems that devices like this can emulate prefer a 16:9 screen. So if you're going to go for a widescreen, you need to be focused mostly on the kinds of consoles that would use that widescreen, consoles like the PSP. And this is where things start to get quite interesting and honestly quite surprising for the M18. The M18 comes packed with an RK3566 quad-core CPU and a Mali G52 GPU supported by 1GB of DDR RAM. Now this means up to PlayStation 1 emulation is fantastic on this device. I'd give it a 10 out of 10 for PlayStation 1. It performs smoothly with no issues whatsoever, and it's a true pleasure to use on this device. And as you'd expect, all emulation prior to that goes along suit. The interesting areas when we look at N64 and PSP. Now looking at N64 first, and this is not a very good experience. Most of the games I played on the N64 struggled somewhat, with very choppy audio and visuals, making for a not playable experience. You can definitely see that the M18 is not built to deal with N64 games, and this is a shame because being able to play PS1 games makes you feel like we should be able to play N64 games. Now the systems were quite different in how they were made. N64 games are harder to emulate, but if you're the type of gamer that was looking for those generations of experiences, it is a shame to not be able to enjoy those N64 games. So when we move up generations and go towards a PSP, we would expect to see similar kind of performance. However, I was amazed to see that the PSP emulation was a lot better than the N64. Now it's not perfect, don't don't get me wrong. It's not the level of PS1, but it is mighty good for the system and a lot better than I expected. Most PSP games that I played performed pretty smoothly. I'd give it an 8 out of 10. Games like God of War, although you could see it wasn't running at peak 100% performance, it was giving a very playable gameplay experience, and the type of experience that you can enjoy without taking away from the fun. And this for me was really important because, as we said, this screen on the M18 is suited to PSP types of games, so to see that it can handle those games somewhat was really important, and thankfully means that the screen was not just a gimmick. Now there's definitely room for improvement, and I do believe that maybe with some tinkering, maybe with some custom firmware in the background, we could see even better PSP experiences. It does make me feel that during the development of the M18 they did try to focus on the PSP somewhat, which is why we got some improved performance in that area. Because usually when we see devices like this that can play up to PSP emulation, we'll see Dreamcast as well, or Nintendo DS, but we don't see that on this. We see a jump from PS1 and N64 up to the PSP, which makes me think that they did put some focus and attention on getting the PSP emulation right. As it stands, it's a really great choice for under $76 and a really fun experience. And it's definitely a step in the right direction that makes me think this manufacturer is heading in the right way, making me really curious for what the M19 and M20 could be further down the line. If you want to get your hands on one, links will be in the description below. And if you want to check out the M17 for comparison, check out this video right here.